we're we're unpacking. So it's really kind of, it's one of these awkward things. If I titled each session according to the beatitude that it kind of expounds, the beatitudes would be running backwards in order, and that confuses people. When you say Sermon on the Mount number 1 or number 2, you know, the persecution of righteousness, that people think, oh, hang on, that's the last one, and then suddenly you're doing it right at the front. So we'd kind of it would run the wrong way. So we're actually looking at the issue of being pure in heart, but it kind of fits in, as we've seen. And we were looking last week at the issue of dominance, and the way Jesus addresses that in terms of the way we disparage, the way we talk about people. You see, if we're talking about people in disparaging ways, what we're doing is we're elevating ourselves in our minds as to being above them. And so there's a kind of a dominance issue. And then as we kind of move on, this week we're going to be looking at fidelity. And he talks about divorce. Jesus talks about divorce. He's also going to talk about integrity. And he's going to talk about let your yes be yes, your no be no. Everything else comes from evil. And we're going to have those verses in the mix. And then kind of next week, we're looking at the issue of mercy. So I just thought it's just kind of interesting to see the flow. Because then when Jesus expounds them, the Sermon on the Mount, the genius of it is you can clearly see, if you like, there are little groups that seem to expound in reverse order the Beatitudes he's given. But equally, there are themes that kind of build and kind of develop and take you on a journey as you go through. So we've gone through dominance. We're thinking about fidelity today. There's the issue of integrity today. And next time there's mercy. So where we're really thinking about today, pure in heart, is this fidelity integrity issue. But as we're going to see, sometimes you'll think about it this way: is showing you something in the Sermon on the Mount, and in the context of showing you, I may kind of expound quite a lot of modern psychology, and you think, well, you're rather pushing the boat out a bit, Chris. There, you know, it doesn't say that much. But the point I'm trying to illustrate in many ways is how actually fundamental the themes that Jesus picks up. So even though he gives us the theme in tiny kind of almost a handful of sentences, he's actually picking up themes that, as we see when we unpack them from a psychological point of view, there is a massive research, because they become massively important to the kind of the flow of interpersonal and so our interpersonal relationships, but also our kind of intrapersonal understanding of ourselves. And that's the kind of the genius of the way Jesus does it. As I touched on this last week, is he gives these handful of words, a handful of example sentences that are recorded for us in a nicely flowing structure, which makes up the Sermon on the Mount, and then he hands that over to his disciples, who then look to teach others, teaching everything that I've taught you, so they teach others. And some of those things then probably come out in the writings of Paul and others, but equally by the guidance of the Holy Spirit, who brings all things to remembrance for the apostles in their generation. But equally, as we're working through things, he makes the word live, and we see things in it that were beyond the intentions of the authors, or we bring the best understandings that we have, just as Paul did. As Paul brought his understanding of the Old Testament to bear on the story of Jesus, and we can study and we can learn. We bring those things together under the guidance of the Holy Spirit through the chain of the church, with the words of Jesus as the kind of the kernel of the seed. They have their effect in us. They reproduce something in us. So by showing you the psychology that goes with it in the modern world, a big chunk of that, 50% of why we're doing it, is to show you how significant it is, that the subject that Jesus raises is important. So fidelity, that there are so many things I could put into this. For instance, it's just the issue of betrayal, of which the most common everyday experience of betrayal is probably an affair within marriage, is massively, massively damaging in a way that things like loss is not. Now that sounds a very tragic, terrible thing to say, because loss is terrible. But over time, you learn to manage loss. But betrayal is different. Betrayal, if it's going to actually be dealt with, time doesn't do it. It is actually rebuilding. It's actually transformation that changes betrayal. There's always, if you talk to anybody, and this has now been studied again, but I didn't cover it tonight, so I'm just saying it up front. If you talk to any psychologist that works with betrayal, they'll tell you that the key is you have to bring transformation. You have to build something new in the life of the person who's been betrayed for them to actually overcome what they've gone through. And so in a mini way, you often see that where someone's gone through that within their relationships, is they kind of, the new them is sort of them, but in a brand new way, rather than just trying to reclaim and repair what's been hurt and what's been damaged. So fidelity is a very important thing, and Jesus is going to touch on it tonight. And integrity, which is so fundamental to trust. But of course, it's trust that gets broken when fidelity gets broken. So really what I'm trying to just draw is that there's a kind of a logic. It sometimes seems odd when we think about this, that the pure in heart has this thing about being truthful and honest, and actually having and not betraying relationships, not betraying your marriage relationship in particular, and the issue of how we position and think about our sexual drives within that mix. And so it's really kind of just, it's where we're going tonight. I always have to say, because I always used to love the story, I think it's probably apocryphal, but I really hope it isn't. But, I remember when I grew up, through the 70s and 80s in church, where my dad, I had a history, my dad used to smuggle Bibles. So as children, I have my earliest memories actually as a child. Some of my earliest memories are driving around Europe in a camper van, which were on routes that my dad had established, smuggling Bibles. Whether he had Bibles at the time when we were with him as a family, I'm not sure. And visiting the underground church in Eastern Europe. But out of that story, I heard about I heard a story of a teacher. Just as we're beginning to see in the modern world today in the West, it's often where the propaganda is pushed through is through children's education. Who when the moon landings were when Yuri Gagarin had gone into space, had been teaching the class how people used to think God lived in space, but we've been there and look, and you can see the pictures, nobody's there. And there was a little girl in the classroom who puts her hand up and says, was Yuri Gagarin pure in heart? And the teacher looks surprised, and the child says, because the Bible says it's only the pure in heart that see God. and of course it's a beautiful story. I hope it's true. It probably isn't. But I can remember that same thing in a debate we had at school, where a guy who I was actually quite friendly with, really, Simon, who was one of those who became quite trendily kind of atheistic, was proposing that God was dead and so on. He made a kind of joke about when a Christian looks at a flower and says he sees God, what does he mean? Is you see a little face with a beard on it? And I think he was the only person who actually laughed at his joke. But the point he was kind of making is, how do you see God? And there is a very simple sense. It actually, the more, as we're going to see as Jesus unpacks it, the more sophisticated we get, the more it's hard to settle on anything. The harder it becomes. So there's a place to come to conclusions. And if you're someone who's like me, who's very motivated by question asking, quite a large chunk of the population are. If you are prompted in those ways, when that tendency goes over itself, is to kind of deny the need we have to actually settle on something. It doesn't mean to say you have to become dogmatic about it, but sometimes we need to say, okay, I'm going to make this is my best assumption. As I start to put life together, coming to a simplicity, say there's so many unknowns here, I can't answer that question yet, but I think this looks most reasonable. So I settle here, I settle there. Actually, as my heart gets purer and simpler, I find it easier to see God. When the questions are just running wild, I have to bring some of them down to, don't fully know, but this is my best solution. This is my best answer. Is that making sense, hopefully? Anyway, that's we're going to, just a quick thing to flag again up front. I've put agape in its relation to eros. We all know, we're all very familiar with the unconditional love, agape love, the four loves as C.S. Lewis writes about them. I'm going to put it into its relationship with eros because we're going to think about marriage and sexual relationships tonight. And actually, Scripture is dangerously includes that as part of the metaphor for our relationship with God. So I put it here: the love of God is presented as the marriage of Christ, but actually, a dangerous idea shunned in most religious and philosophical systems, but is foundationally biblical. What I mean by that is almost universally within the Christian church, we understand, for instance, the Song of Solomon as being a metaphor of the marriage of Christ and the bride, which is then is kind of completed in Revelation. And that theme, actually, you find goes right the way back. You can trace it. I'm not going to do it tonight, take too long, but you can trace it right the way from Genesis. The issue of the marriage, which then is concluded in Revelation. So it's a massive theme that overarches Scripture. And here in Song of Solomon, actually the language is kind of dangerous, quite dangerous. It talks about my lover and we're not married yet, but they're at the door and I'm only very lightly clothed and my heart is beating and I'm thinking, should I open the door to him? And actually the bride kind of is drawn with desire and opens the door, but fortunately he's gone. But then she runs out into the night and she's only loosely dressed and clothed. And actually these ideas, it's kind of one of these things where we say kind of nice and neatly and tidily, it's the marriage supper of Christ and his church, but we miss the fact there is this there's some very deep imagery in that mix. There's some intimacy in it, and when we finish tonight, we will look at the relationship within marriage of what we sometimes is called passionate love, and how it transforms into companionate love, and which is much more a kind of the thing in which agape has overflown from. And so actually I just my kind of my preloader up front is actually that there's a significance not just in terms of the social aspects of how we do life amongst each other, but there are things for us to learn and draw from in a kind of a deeper way, and in terms of our relationship with the Lord and the understanding of his marriage with the church and what he's looking for and the desire that the Lord has for us, which has often been downplayed. It's kind of like, oh, he can take us or leave us. God doesn't have any desires. He doesn't have any real needs. But that's not the metaphor that's used scripturally. So anyway, leave that one as a thought. I put here the exchanged image for image. Again, I've got a few of these slides which are kind of about just setting things up, really. But we're going to think about the role of sex in terms of our identity, because that's a big issue that we find in the world today. And I just wanted to notice that since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen. This is Paul writing through what was made. Okay, so actually our understanding of me and my humanity is helping me to understand the image of God. So the people were without excuse, because you can discover something about the image of God in my own drives and my own makeup, my own psychology. It's not exactly like for like, but it is genuinely reflective, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense to say we're made in God's image. For although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give him thanks. So there is a problem. We can understand God, but if we're going to see it clearly, we have to do so where we're acknowledging him as God and we're grateful. And this is something of the purity of heart coming into place. So we can look at the makeup we have as human beings and we can see something of God as long as we're pure of heart. Pure of heart, some of that therefore is we're acknowledging him as God and we're grateful for what we've got, who he is and so on. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for an image resembling mortal human beings, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. So God gave them over to the desires of their heart and to impurity, to dishonour their bodies amongst themselves. And of course, this is the first time we're going to see where Jesus addresses the issues of a kind of broken sexuality in the world. This right at the beginning in the Sermon on the Mount. So if we're fitting those things together. You remember Richard Schwader and Jonathan Haidt. One was a sociologist who kind of talks about you understand moral dimensions in terms of autonomy, my senses of freedom, community and sanctity, and Jonathan Haidt then turned it into a list of 6. So there's elements tonight as we look through. I've highlighted in the different coloured labels of the fairness cheating, which is something about me and my freedoms. What am I free to do or not free to do? How do those things get restricted? There's something about loyalty and betrayal, which is a community dynamic, which affects that community level. And there's very definitely a sanctity degradation, which a lot of people, particularly the academia or intelligentsia in the Western world, kind of poo-poo and laugh at sanctity or degradation. And yet the funny thing is, while they say they don't really believe in it, when one of them's ordering their kind of soy latte with vegan toast, I mean, the idea, if you come in eating at McDonald's, that they don't actually feel the sense of disgust of sanctity and have those feelings in them is just a joke. It's just they've kind of wrapped them in other language so that they can sort of be ignored. But we all have those elements. And these things are kind of going to be in play as we think through the verses tonight. This is sorry, I'm doing a lot of slides which are just really about setting up background. The kind of seminal work of the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who's normally considered to be a Christian philosopher, and I think is the case. I'm not one of those that's kind of one out and you're out. He was struggling in the modern world, trying to make sense of his Christian faith. When I use the word modern, I don't mean today. We're kind of postmodern, but he was there at the dawn of modernity. But he wrote his seminal kind of work, is Purity of Heart, is to will one thing, by which when he talks about willing, it's kind of the desiring, it's the thing in you that drags your attention. And a lot of his kind of writing is around that idea which you hear expressed by people like Jung, that actually we all need a God, an image of God. We all have an image of God. And what it is the thing we will desire and which we will kind of be drawn to, and it will shape us. And in Kierkegaard's sense, from a postmodern, from an existential point of view, by which I mean that he was part of that generation that was struggling, saying, if morality hasn't come from the outside, well, that's an if I put it that way. if it hasn't come from the outside, and therefore it's something you create yourself, then actually the only way you can be totally moral is by being absolutely pure of heart. So one of the things that is distinct between, if you like, modern postmodernism, if that makes sense, modern postmodernism, is you kind of go and do anything you like now. Whereas actually the early existentialists, who were kind of the grandfathers or grandparents of the modern movement, they understood that actually if there is nothing from the outside, if you're going to create any sense of meaning in the world, then you have to start, as you start to make decisions, you need to stay consistent to them. And so he talks about, therefore, there's kind of the ideas of purity of heart, and that becomes your God, and actually that Christianity has at its heart this wonderful story that he absolutely thinks is fantastic, and the story of Jesus. And so you living as if it's true, whether it's true or not, but you're pure of heart of that's the best way you can possibly live. Now, I'm, of course, not sharing all of his platform, but I'm just kind of highlighting there is something, though, that is true about this idea that integrity to the thing that you lift up and you aspire to is tied up with this kind of concept of purity of heart. So, you should love the God. Yeah, I put a quote which comes, of course, later in Matthew. You should love the Lord your God with all of your heart. The purity of heart is there's something where it all draws together. So, if you think about that, how it all comes together. So God, just thinking a little bit kind of abstractly, philosophically, we go back to Genesis 1. So it's in the image of God. I put God created him rather than he, because the he is God here. In the image of God, God created him. In the image of God, God created them. So there is something in the concept of mankind that is both the he and the we. Or the him and the them. It's the one and the many. There's the one and the corporate. And we are very much like that. And actually that's reflective of the image of God. So actually the name Elohim, which means God, of course, is a plural. It means the powers or the forces. So the very name itself, which has that kind of Trinitarian overview, it says there's more than just one thing here. And I've put that little kind of symbol in there, which is often done to kind of represent the Trinity. The concept of God, who is he's a family and and an individual at the same time. And within that image of God, he's Lord over all, but he's new every morning. So why have I put that there? Well, because we start to see, because it says he makes God in his image, and he says to them, be fruitful and subdue and have dominion. Well, you have to subdue and have dominion because the image of God, which he's put into us, God is Lord over all, so we have to have a place to exercise dominion and subdue. There is something of mastery, social status and mastery, which is endemic to the image of God. And then on the be fruitful and multiply, because he's new every morning. God is not a static, although under kind of Augustinian theology, God becomes the eternal now and never changes, because if he changes, he wouldn't be perfect. That is not the revelation of Scripture. The revelation is Scripture as a God who is creative, and creative by nature of the word creative means that tomorrow there's something they weren't yesterday. And you can say, oh, well, God's outside of time, so tomorrow doesn't exist. But there's some correlate of tomorrow. There's some way in which God is new and fresh every morning, and there's a kind of an extension. And of the increase of his government, there is no end. Those kinds of statements, there is something generative. And so in our lives, in the nature of humanity, he's put something that expresses itself by multiplication and the desire to reproduce that image, just as he himself had that desire to reproduce his image. You kind of move on down, as I say, in us, or in God, and in God's image in us then produces that sense of social status and mastery as a need. Or social connection, love and community, which is kind of exemplified in marriage. So that's the image of the eternal God. But of course, which Paul is talking about, which we can look and we can see in us things that reflect that. But of course, they kind of go wrong. Yeah, okay. So when we focus just on the image, that was it. I was trying to be clever with my graphics. You remember that little quote, everything in the world is about sex except sex, which is about power. When we actually now start to focus on the image rather than the God who it's the image of, when we put something other than God at the pinnacle, so we're now putting the image of God at the pinnacle, and somehow the way in which they all get blended together starts to come apart. And so, we can we see that they interplay, sex and aggression interplay. Everything is about sex except sex, which is about power. I've put a little quote there. David Landrum was he was the EA. He worked in the EA as a kind of political liaison. Before that, he was with CARE, and he used to have an office in the Houses of Parliament, and he used to work with Christians from all the political persuasions. Before that, he had a doctorate in politics, and he was a lecturer at a university. And before that, he'd been a total atheist and a builder. He has a great kind of testimony how he got there. I remember him speaking once. He said, the secular always reduces to the sexular. He actually resigned his membership of the Labour Party a few years ago for various reasons of integrity. Actually, probably the reasons that we're looking at tonight. Their inability to really come to terms with something, and hopefully I'm not upsetting anybody here, I'm just telling you a true story. He felt he needed to resign because there were issues of integrity that he saw not going on, and there were issues to do with their understanding of the role of sex and the way actually of family that used to be so key, and in their understanding of upholding of society that was now being thrown out of the window and actively promoted against. Now, that's not uniquely a left-wing thing. It goes across the board. But as we will see, there is a bit of a history through things like the Fabian Society that has often taken issues of sex and control and turned them into something that looks good politically. And actually, that's something to notice. I'm trying not to be too political because I don't believe that God is either conservative or a Labour voter. So I'm not wanting to sound that way, but the concept of eugenics, which we often hear the word as a terrible word because it is. We've seen what it leads to. Was an original kind of it was a kind of a good idea that came out of the Fabian Society, which is that actually there are too many people in the world. Well, we don't want to kill them with a gun. So what we'll do is we'll control it by actually only allowing worthy people to actually breed. If that makes sense. So I'm not going to unpack all of these things, but can you see how when the world has reduced the view from the God who created to now focus on the image of God, which you think that would be just as fine, but it all starts to fall apart. And so the secular kind of reduces to the sexular, and it kind of therefore goes a muddy grey. That was my little clever point with my gone from black and white. Everything starts to blur and becomes confused. And actually, I've just put up here. I saw it as does anyone know the Babylon Bee? The Christian satire site. It's remarkable because as a Christian site, it regularly gets quoted in secular newspapers. I don't know if you saw during last week where Justin Trudeau kind of added some extra letters to the LGBTQ acronym, which is growing all the time. So it starts with two SL something or other. It was something like 23 letters long. And there's a funny little bit clip where he tries to actually say it and he keeps on getting the letters in the wrong order and he keeps starting again, which is kind of almost surreally funny when you watch it. But the thing I quite liked is they put up a headline that said, experts predict LGBTQ acronym could circle the earth 3 times by 2022. And in one sense, the thing is why they're funny is because there is a truth to this. I'm not trying to be unkind to anybody. Because actually, as we're going to see, the issues of sex and dominance are key to our sense of identity. And where I sit within society and who I'm kind of intimate with becomes a strong sense for those that haven't got God as their identity, because that's what's left of his image in them, that the God who is all powerful, so he's given us with dominion. The God who is new every morning, so he's given us the ability to reproduce. Because we're left with that image, we somehow know that's where our identity should be found in those ways. And so they become so key to us. But as it does, it kind of goes, you get more and more, it goes from black and white now to shades of grey. And that's my kind of little polemic kind of kickoff to the things. And if you think about the process. Don't worry, we will get onto the Sermon on the Mount tonight. I promise you we will. But you see, Jesus has put these things right up front, and they are so fundamental to the way the world works, to politics, to science, to social interactions. So we read in Genesis 3, they heard Yahweh's voice. I've changed most of them to YHWH. They changed Yahweh's voice, walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid. So you remember we looked at the flight mechanism, fight and flight, that is controlled by the brain stem, the kind of the reptilian part that as it connects to the autonomic nervous system affects our whole body. There's an element of that gears us for flight as well as for fighting. So here we see them. Why? Well, because they're fearful. We'll see that in a second. So they hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh, of God, amongst the trees of the garden. It's interesting, isn't it, how people actually often hide from God in the very things that he's gifted them with, just as a thought. So Yahweh God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" And the man said, "I heard your voice in the garden. I was afraid." So there's the fear factor. So we saw it. Fear produces fight or flight. Because I was naked and I hid myself. There's the flight again. And then he suddenly turns it around because now he's been found. He can't hide anymore. See. I wanted to hide, but now because I can't, I'm going to fight. So mankind turns it around. The man turns it around. He says, it's the woman who you gave me. So it's her fault and it's your fault because it's her fault because she did it and you should have known better and you gave her to me. So he blames God and he blames the woman. So now he's in a fight situation. She gave me the fruit and I ate it. And God said to the woman, I'm skipping a couple of verses, your desire, I put the word breed there, which if you remember we looked at again for the autonomic nervous system, your desire, there's something about the reproductive desire, will be for your husband and or but, because it's just a little conjunctive, we can't tell whether it means and or but. Your desire will be for him, but he'll rule over you. And to Adam he said, in painful toil you will eat. So I've put the word feed there, because if you remember, as we looked at the autonomic nervous system, the whole of the human body kind of reflects this duality. That the sympathetic nervous system, that actually as fear kind of hits us, kind of really becomes active, and we refer to it as our fight or flight instinct. There are various double jointed ways of referring to the parasympathetic nervous system. I use broaden and build because it's my favourite, but notice below feed and breed is in there. All of those things which are there at the beginning of Genesis, that kind of have been impacted and affected because of the fall of mankind. You see, so man has fallen, so all those areas have been impacted, and here is Jesus now addressing it, and he's starting to deal with our brokenness in these areas and sowing something in, because these are key areas that God wants to work on in terms of our growth and development, and layer by layer putting things back the way they should be. So there's a strong kind of connection when it comes to fight or flight for social dominance with the hormone serotonin. So we have the autonomic nervous system, and then within the brain, the social status is very linked to the way in which serotonin works. It's very complicated, and we're only scratching the surface with serotonin. It's one of the least understood, but we know that it's really key to mental well-being, and we 100% know that actually that those key moments, exactly how they stay with us over the long term, we're not fully sure yet. But in a simple ways, it seems as your serotonin goes up, you need to do positive things, that you want to do positive things with it, if I can put it that way. So that it's more than just a kind of a moment of, I just punched somebody down. But serotonin is linked to that. Oxytocin is very much about the broaden and build. And actually oxytocin starts with our sex instinct. Those two, they're both, if I put them, I showed you, they're both what we think of as happy hormones. Happy hormones are ways in which, when we start to get the little kick of cortisol in the body, which is a very natural thing which we need for a fulfilled life, that little burst of cortisol is normally satisfied by one of the happy hormones, and the four main ones I've put up there. If we only satisfy with endorphins or dopamine, if it just stops there, you can pretty much guarantee that people might have a pleasurable life, but it won't be that happy in the longer term. If it's oxytocin or serotonin gets involved in the mix, alongside the others as well, there is the possibility of it fixing itself in you in a way that actually makes you happier. So really kind of happiness comes down to fixing with what we think of as the happy hormones, moving from pure pleasure into something that has that longer term impact on us, with oxytocin and serotonin. And so you can see those two hormones, which I touched on last week, relate to the sex and aggression drive. But here we're seeing how they all blend together. So if I go back, sorry, that's here. There is a desire, there's a sexual desire, but actually there is a ruling over, there is a dominance issue that has now come into, there's something in the mix, but this is all happening as a result of the fall and the fear and the walking away from God. So we're kind of getting the ingredients together to start to put the cake together and start to understand a little bit what's kind of going on in the human heart from a Christian point of view, but actually backed up with a little bit of science. So there is this kind of complex relationship of serotonin and oxytocin, and I put it in mate selection and attraction. So I was going to put these so that one popped up after the other. Actually, forgot to do that. There's the beast. Will you marry me? Yes, says the. And actually, while we might make it a little bit more romantic looking, the picture on the right is still fundamentally the same picture. There is a strange kind of relationship, or there is a strange kind of connection. It's not necessarily part of God's design. It is something that he points out. It's not even something he forced on them. It's something that has come about as a result of the fall, which is actually there is something in very broad terms, because we're going to see behaviours are not exclusive to one sex or the other, but they just tend to be tendencies. And actually tendencies, when you work them out over a long period of time, tend to produce pretty consistent behaviours, if that makes sense. So when you work them out on the mass, so you can have a feminine woman or a masculine man, that's fine as an individual, but you add it all up and actually you do see in almost every kind of thing you ever measure, there are differences in the sexes, and the concept of the beauty and the beast, both in looks and in terms of behaviour, is not at all uncommon. We can romanticize it with the knight and the maiden, of course. Or famously, if anyone remembers this quote, there's Caroline Aherne as Mrs. Merton, where she asked what first, Debbie, attracted you to the millionaire Paul Daniels? Which is one of that kind of, because actually the millionaire bit is about his dominion, his social status. And actually that, unfortunately, as a motif, is an ancient and old one. Is not necessarily even a bad one, if I can put it that way, in the sense of you get it a little bit in the story of Ruth. Boaz is an older man. He is an older, wealthy man, and she's a younger girl. It's like Colonel Brandon and what's her name in Sense and Sensibility. There is a kind of a common thing that often, as we're going to see, there is something which we can, without wanting to be too stereotypical or forcing people into boxes, there is a tension between this issue of dominance and aggression and sex selection, which is deeply interrelated. One feeds into another. And so it's not surprising to me that Jesus, who's actually looked at issues of winning kind of arguments, winning battles, which is about social status, and then follows it up with actually even how it plays out now into the relationship of marriage, and actually husbands who casually divorce their wives, which we will see is the case as we're looking into it. Because so I'm going to illustrate it kind of with the story, I'm calling it the story of the lonely lobster. Because famously, there's a famous interview with Jordan Peterson and I've forgotten her name now, the newsreader on Channel 4. There's a little bit where he makes a point to do with social hierarchies. He says, the infrastructure goes back to the time before there were trees, he says to her. And what he's referring to is actually by studying lobsters, you can see the two dynamics of serotonin and oxytocin. It's slightly different in lobsters. So this is the story of the lonely lobster. So lobsters are very aggressive. So here's two lobsters. So actually, if two lobsters ever meet each other, if you go to a restaurant where they serve lobsters, you see them in the tank together as if they're best buds. They're not. They chop each other to pieces with those big. That's what those big pincers are for. So the story of the lonely lobster is they will mash any lobster that comes near them. So in the restaurants, they put rubber bands around their claws, so that they really want to chomp, but they can't. There it goes. So that one's just got beaten. When a lobster meets another lobster, they get into a fight, but they're sensible in the sense of they don't always make the fight go to the death. You see, so one disappears and goes off. But what happens in that transaction is the winning lobster gets a kick of serotonin, and that kick of serotonin won't last forever, but it will last for a period. But it makes that kick of serotonin will actually make him get bigger. It actually expands his body. In humans, it actually makes us stand a little bit taller and a little bit prouder when we get a kick of serotonin. So it's having similar effects. In a similar way as we thought last week, the kind of battles we're fighting aren't to the death. We're just kind of putting that person down. We're taking them to court. We're winning things in those ways. As we're going to see next week, Jesus is going to say about actually turn the other cheek. Don't try and win those battles. We're going to do it differently. We're going to approach this differently. So that lobster there has got himself a nice little kick of serotonin. So he's suddenly, as he gets a bit bigger, just move him over here, he starts to really become attractive as a mate for female lobsters. So here's my little cute one. Carrying a little kind of love heart, you're my lobster. So he becomes much more attractive to female lobsters. The trouble is, so he's got all that serotonin in him, and the serotonin genuinely making him more attractive as his shape is different, his behaviour becomes different, and those things kind of create that sort of sense of glow that attracts the female lobster. She starts to notice it. But she's got a problem, because if she comes near him, he's not that discerning, because he's not that smart. He'll just chop her to pieces like he would the previous lobster he beat. But she's female, and she's now ready to have babies or lay eggs. So she wants to lay eggs, so what can she do? Well, she produces the lobster equivalent of oxytocin, which is called isotocin. And not wanting to put too fine a point on it, what she does is she kind of comes as close as she dares, and then she urinates into the water towards his face. And he breathes in all of her oxytocin filled, or her isotocin filled, and so her oxytocin, which is actually tied to her femininity, if I can put that. When we're talking about lobsters, she has it, he doesn't. She leaves a bunch of it for him to suck up. When it gets into his system, it suddenly, he moves from being kind of the aggressive fighter, and because she's the lobster that's there, he suddenly bonds to her. And I'm not sure whether it's totally true. The kind of the common logic is that lobsters mate for life. But she's the only one that is allowed in non-aggressively because of this little or isotocin, lobster equivalent of oxytocin, kind of interplay that's gone on between them. So can you see that I'm just kind of using the thing that the role of serotonin, the role of oxytocin, actually is incredibly ancient in the animal world. It's fundamental to male and female, and it has complex kind of interplay between the two. The serotonin is making him more attractive. The oxytocin is making him more lovely, and so on. So let's come to the text now. So that's all preamble. Just keeping an eye. We've just got to the text. Yeah, we're not doing too badly. So Matthew 5:27. You've heard how it said, "You shan't commit adultery." But I would say to you that anyone who looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So Jesus is putting the situation to the men. Now, it's not actually the case that it is only men who, according to the law, could divorce. There is a single verse that is about the men only. We'll come to that in a minute. So the reality is that marriage is assumed, but it's just not explicit. That's why we don't if we don't understand the culture, we don't understand necessarily the text. So marriage is a covenant. So the rules about covenant and who breaks covenant, and if either party breaks covenant, then actually you can sue for divorce effectively. But the covenant doesn't actually specifically make adultery a sin. The covenant is, and actually we see the marriage covenant reflected. I think it's in, it's one of the minor prophets. It's Hosea, I think. I think it's in Hosea. He actually the actual kind of words are almost mimicked in God speaking to the Israelites in there, because they've been dug up. We found the kind of the text of them, and they are a commitment that goes in both directions for the provision of food, clothing, and comfort. So food, clothing, and security, or love, and so on. And he doesn't say that has to be exclusive. So men actually sometimes could have multiple wives. That was true within Jewish culture, but he couldn't withhold his love from a wife because he'd met someone younger. So now that's not because that's what God wanted. It's an accommodation for where people were and the way those things worked. But the actual commitment is, and so if he broke any of those, if for instance the husband stopped providing food, stopped providing physical comfort, and stopped providing warmth and clothing, then she had grounds for divorce. But there was a specific case where a husband, if he found an indecent matter in his wife, which is almost universally meant that she had an affair with somebody, could divorce her for that reason. So I'm just kind of giving you the background. So anyone who looks, so Jesus said, I would say to you, and he's saying it now to the men because he's talking about to their wives, their women to lust after them have already committed adultery with her in her heart. And so the first things we kind of notice is Jesus is focusing our attention on that kind of the private inner life again. We see it later again in Matthew's Gospel. Woe to you, experts in the law and the Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're full of greed. This is a good example of what he's driving at when he says that. You've got the outward appearance, but the outward appearance is not as straightforward as we might think it is. This is where purity in heart is starting to come in. It's not just that they're impure thoughts because they're lustful thoughts. There's impure thoughts because actually they're also, there's practice involved, which is incredibly sophist, very kind of clever with the text. And there's a lot of cleverness going on with the text here. So we saw these verses the last couple of weeks, from the Talmuds. So anyone who descends to Gehenna ultimately ascends, except for three. Who do not ascend. These are they, the one who engages in intercourse with a married woman. You see, it's with a married woman there. So what you're seeing reflected here is that the rabbis had now come to the conclusion that that a man's other extramarital relationships were okay as long as that woman wasn't currently married. As this is a transgression, it's a serious offence to God and to a person. The person here is not the woman, it's to the other husband. So they have taken the concept of adultery and they've actually turned it into something that only counts with certain people. And then, to make it worse, as we're going to see, they've made it very easy for men to get divorced. Not for women, still hard, but very easy for men. So this is true. It's an offence against God and the person, the one who humiliates another in public and the one who calls another a derogatory name. You see, that's from the other week, the derogatory name and so on. Now we're on to this, we're now on to the sexual practices. So this is just going on with if we kind of see Jesus constantly does this idea of taking from the public we can see and turning it into the inner. This is part of discipleship. Because these things that come out of the mouth come from the heart, and these things defile a person. For out of the heart comes all sorts of evil ideas. Murder, he covered that last week. Adultery and sexual immorality. So adultery, and sexual immorality he's going to address today. Theft, false testimony and slander. That was again part of last week. So you see these ideas aren't just kind of flying through. They keep regularly coming back. They're Old Testament scriptural ideas that play out into the New Testament in the teaching of Jesus in a regular cyclic sort of way. For the mouth speaks what fills the heart. So there's something here in the debates that are going on. Man looks at, which kind of is reflective of that idea from the Old Testament, that man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. We're not going to say very much about this guy. This is Emil Durkheim, who's kind of effectively the founder of the academic discipline of sociology. But actually his kind of great discovery, which led to the whole science of sociology, is he established a relationship between the strength and meaning of a person's social connections and their rates of suicide. So the marriage, of course, is a key connector. The strength of meaning of those things, as we're going to see in Jesus' day, have become trivial. And I'd say, of course, they've become trivial today, the strength and meaning of those social connections. And copious studies have now tracked and confirmed what he looks at, how growth and quality of more general relationships develops. Oh yeah, that's another outflow. So first of all, the relationships have to mean something. There has to be and they have to have strength to them. And strength are often things like the difference between, and I don't want to sound judgmental when I'm saying this, I'm trying to express to a generation that often thinks, well, what's the difference between if I just kind of casually move in with someone or if I'm married to them? Well, the difference is it's a much bigger thing in terms of how it impacts you if you stand in front of a crowd of people and you make a commitment to someone that actually locks itself into you in a different way. So you're adding more strength and meaning to these relationships. So his initial discovery was around suicide rates and strength and meaning in relationships. It's led to the whole science of sociology. And we're going to see this kind of little network of simple relationships. And since then, what we've found is that key sexual relationship, or that key mating pairing relationship, which is about expressing the image of God, who is new every morning, the creative nature of God in humankind, in mankind, has given birth to the whole science. And not only that, it turns out that actually the quality of our relationships generally are all actually built out of practice and experience of the key relationships. So first of all, when you're a child, to the mother, because the mother is giving birth to the child, and then as you come into becoming a parent yourself, whatever sex you are, it's the qualities of the relationships that you're making there will be reflective actually of the qualities of relationships and numbers of relationships you can have elsewhere. So there's a huge amount of science that flows from a very simple idea. In one sense, what I'm trying to do by saying lobsters, lobsters have been swimming around since before our ancestors. Apologies if you're a young Earth creationist. Since before our ancestors climbed up onto the beach to have a sunbathe, it's right there in all of creation. Cries out this image in us. That relationship that is going to reflect the image of God is also the foundation for how we start to understand and create the bigger community, and God himself, who has always been a community, as well as being a producer, as well as being a creator, are all in there. So okay, here's another one which I did the talk through the Sermon on the Mount in this way a couple of years ago. So this was a bit of research I found when I was preparing for that, which I always like to kind of just freak everybody out by saying, I told my wife that I've just been doing some research into pornography on the internet. Sorry, and this is totally inappropriate. I don't know. I don't have boundaries when I'm preaching. But here's the fruit of my searching, if I put it that way. There's a study that was done by this Centre for Behavioural Neuroscience. It actually tracked the viewing patterns of men and women looking at sexual photographs. It's probably so he actually had kind of computerized cameras on their eyes, so the images were kind of being shown to them on the computer, and it tracks where their eyes were going, so they could tell what was going on. And the results aren't actually what one would typically might think or expect, and I find actually kind of interesting and encouraging. So actually men looked first, longest, and more often at faces and eyes. Okay, so just want to hit that. Now women, and there was a difference depending on whether women were taking hormone replacements or not. Hormones to effect for contraception, sorry. So if you're taking a hormonal contraceptive, it's slightly different. But women who weren't, so they were much more in their natural state, if I can put it that way, they tended to look first and longest and most intently at the environmental context, i.e. it's a nice sofa, there are curtains and so on. Okay. Whereas women who are on those hormonal drugs tended to focus first on intimate sexual body parts, which is probably something of the effect that is had by the hormone that is actually kind of putting them in the place where it's almost ready for the sexual congress. But actually, just in a more natural state, actually our first sexual instincts are in men for connection, and in women for security. You hear that? See that sort of thing. Oops, hang on. Let's go back. It's a tentative conclusion that men are looking for acceptance and value. So they're looking in faces, they're looking in eyes. That's where you read value from. Women are looking for security and safety. And actually those were reflected in those marriage covenants, the Jewish marriage covenants of protection and warmth, clothing and affection, those things. And of course, I think is more in the mental, in your head. Sex is a much more complex than this, but the research is perhaps capturing this very simple sort of need that's in there. Just trying to think, because I thought this would be a good point to kind of draw a little simple kind of conclusion in one sense. Okay, I'll move on. We might come back to it. I might remember what I was going to say at that point. But actually, as I say, love and sex are much more complex. So it's probably why Jesus doesn't necessarily unpack it all, but what he does is he draws our attention right to this key relationship, which is the mating. It's the for this reason a man shall leave his mother and father. So there's a parent relationship that's fundamental to shaping who we are. But then and cleave to his wife, and this becomes the place where we learn and practice how now to be a mature adult. So we've been shaped as children by the relationship of parents. Now we step into adulthood and it's our partner. And actually there are fundamentals in what's going on there that impact how we're going to behave and how we're going to relate to people. And the oxytocin, which creates the bond, which is foundational to the physical and emotional shape of womanhood, just as testosterone is fundamental to the shape and mentality of malehood. But in both sexes, the hormone exists. It's about amounts. So the base level of oxytocin is higher in women, testosterone is higher in men. But actually, then on top of the base level, that's only part of the way in which the thing makes us behave. We get these little spikes and kicks of oxytocin. And we'll think a bit more about it next week when we're going to look at the issue of mercy, because actually there are a host of ways in which as we get little bursts of oxytocin, as we put them together with our behaviour, we create trust, which is more than just trust within a marriage, but that's often where it starts, because that's where the big intense kicks and bursts and changes in those hormonal levels are going to happen with that initial partner, that person who you're first able to be vulnerable with, to the degrees of there being no clothing and all of these sorts of things. Hopefully I'm not being too graphic. But actually sometimes we avoid saying things that are actually so fundamental that the rest of the world is getting on doing their own thing, trying to find their own wisdom, and we've not brought the logic of the gospel to bear on these things. But that place where we first find those areas of trust and relationship and so on, it's out of that pro-social communities grow, ones that are really good for each other. So coming back to the text, I think, I was going to say, so to come back to the verses we've already read, in the modern world, of course, we have the problem is exaggerated. I introduced to you the Hope Circuit in the very first week. The Hope Circuit is following those blue lines, particularly the one that comes to the front cortex, which are they're kind of the reward system, but actually the one that pushes into the front of the brain, into the neocortex, that little blue kind of set of arrows, sometimes we refer to as the Hope Circuit, which is driven by dopamine. But sexual arousal is something that we get rewarded for seeking. So if I put it that way, it's part of that system. In the modern world, where we have the delivery of pornographic images, there is a huge problem with breakdowns of relationships, and actually also the basic. If I can kind of say it this way, there's an assault on masculinity that's quite unbelievable, really, for the generation coming through. At one level, they're being told from the outside that their testosterone is toxic. And actually that's by people who don't understand, in one sense, that that we have been made to accomplish something, and that the accomplishment often requires rougher sports. So we will celebrate a film that is about a boy who does ballet. Sorry, I don't may enjoy the films, but we kind of think that playing, if people sit up and watch what's his name? The boxer who was on TV the other night. I forgot. That we should try and discourage that. But actually, there is something in it. I'm not saying that it's a good sport and that it doesn't do damage and all of those sorts of things. But we're fundamentally, if we just kind of go that simple way, let's make it all peaceful and whatever. You're missing something of the adventure of humanity, which I think is pleasing to God and reflects something of God. Yes, we can say some things have gone wrong, but equally there are things that go wrong on the other side. So it's all these things. But the key reason why I say there's such a pressure on men is that they are made in a way that they are visually they are more visually aroused, whereas women tend to be more emotionally aroused. I know that's generalizations, but these things do kind of come out, which is why women look at the soft furnishings and the curtains, and if it looks safe, that gives them a sense of security, and actually I'm in the right emotional place, so I find an arousal from that security, which is why women can be attracted to quite ugly but quite powerful, strong men. It just which is why, hence the tell me, Debbie, what was it about the millionaire Paul Daniels that first attracted you? Is a kind of, it's a genuine sort of thing that happens because it's emotional. But in men who are stimulated visually, that hope circuit, which is also the reward system, has a double whammy because it's dopamine driven, because it's about seeking something. It's not about consummating. So it's not about the consummating, it's about the seeking. So actually the pornography is giving rewards for supposedly finding something which actually they're never really going to find. But the point is the reward system can be burnt out, and that is an absolute truth. And so it is actually producing disengagement, which is one of the components of well-being in men. And it's actually creating erectile dysfunctions in young men. It's taking fertility down. It's having a devastating effect, the modern world, on the male psyche and makeup. And it's probably too simplistic to sit there and be judgmental, because actually there are things available that were not available when I was a kid. I can remember as a primary school 11-year-old, with a friend whose dad was a canon in the Church of England had been given some money for his birthday, and we went to Smith's to try and buy a magazine from the top shelf, but we were too short to reach it. It was difficult, so praise God, it was difficult to get hold of, and that probably saved us to a degree. It actually helped us. So it's just something that we've got to be really very aware of. It's a big issue out there. And actually it has a real devastating effect, because as your reward stroke hope system goes, your hope for anything good in life starts to disappear. You start to get disengaged and you get depressed with life, and you don't realise it's the addictive habit that you have when there's nobody around of turning on the computer and flicking through some things that because they don't seem like they're connected, but they are, you see. So anyway, a quick thought. So next section, Jesus is going to address loving our neighbours, because as I was saying, the this core relationship of man to woman, the first that we're going to produce children from, is the way in which we learn to build with those hormones, to build actually a fruitful life rather than an empty life. So we're going to explore that kind of pro-social growth next week, loving your fellow man from its beginnings in self-serving and reproductive love, because it kind of grows out from there. So as I have that relationship, and then out of that suddenly there's a child on the way, and so now actually between the two of us we're now having to extend the impact of that hormone in the way we think at the kind of the cerebral cortex layer. We're having to now start building shape and make decisions at that level about the life that is coming, and as that it's almost in the overflow of that then we're also enabled to start bringing in our children's friends as they start to make connections, and so our community is growing and growing and growing. And of course it's not the only way, but it's a very fundamental way. So again, Jesus is going to quote later in Matthew, so reading it back in, haven't you read them, that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause a man shall cleave to his father and mother, shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So it's this little family nature. Remember, again, I put it in the context as we started. It's the image of God, and it actually is in his image. But when we start to get impure in our hearts and it starts to get multi-layered, we start to miss the image, and we make the image God. So the image, instead of leading us to the truth, it becomes the thing we worship, and it starts to dissolve, breaks up. But actually the fundamental way we learn that is we're leaving our parents who've taught us a big chunk of it. I've learnt to love them. I've received love from them. I've learnt how to give and take it. I use that embryonically as I start to make relationships. And as that grows and expands, we become bigger in our ability to love. So anyway, keeping an eye on the time. Okay, we've got a quarter of an hour. 1920s, if you go back to there, science was really dominated by a few big ideas. Two of them are Freud's psychoanalysis, and he got really confused about sex and parents, as we know, so we can ignore him. John Watson's behaviourism is slightly different. He's not true, but it's just useful to kind of see the history. He saw love as kind of an action driven by reward and pleasure. You see, so if you can use the reward for pleasurable things to kind of get people to do anything you like. But they were both wrong, and they're nothing buttery. But reward and pleasure is entangled with attachment, so it's kind of, and that's part of the building of the partnerships that are loving. Is actually we're not necessarily, we might say in the front cortex, the front part of our brain, that we love humanity. Loving the person next to you on the bus is different, because it actually hits a lower level. Which is why often it is true that those who speak the most about love do the least. And that's a generalization, but generally it's true. The more people will speak about the idea of love, the less they actually can able to do, because they just tend to be people who live out in that kind of context. But actually, what we find is that the reward-pleasure cycle, which is probably why Jesus says you love your neighbour as you love yourself, is it starts with a place of actually getting into a kind of, I reward myself, I love myself by loving my neighbour, until actually the loving my neighbour starts to overtake the loving myself in the mix. That is a kind of a generally true description of the way in which our ability to take people on and into our kind of close identity of family changes. We saw last week how the use of language can put people in a positive group or a negative group. Do you remember? And our ability to genuinely include people in the positive group, that group can kind of get bigger and bigger as we practice the process of loving ourselves by loving others, doing good for others. So you kind of hear here's John Watson. He kind of says men are built, not born. So we don't agree with this. I'm just showing you his. Give me a baby and I'll make it climb and use its hands in constructing buildings of stone or wood. I can make a thief, a gunman, or a dope fiend. The possibilities in shaping in any direction are almost endless. Now, of course, there is an issue with reward that takes us in a certain way, but part of the reason why mental health absolutely falls apart and lives absolutely fall apart is if you use that reward mechanism to draw people away from what is instinctive, life is horrible for them. And that's a truth it's important to remember, because there's an awful lot of stupid ideology that's trying to make people and lead them into being something that actually their instincts are not like that. The whole thing kind of, his whole theory sort of really fell apart under with a guy called Harry Harlow who developed what we refer to as attachment theory. Here's this little image. You can see that robotic looking mother there. And he tested the theory of rewards. And can you make this monkey behave differently to a normally monkey would by giving it other rewards? You can't, but you can make it very confused and very unhappy by rewarding things it shouldn't do. So here he is. Here's the feeding. He creates a wire cage, but which will feed the monkey, or he's got a soft, cuddly one that feels like its mother. And the monkeys always choose, but they get no affection back. They always choose the cuddly mother, and they never choose the mechanical one, even though the reward comes from the mechanical metal thing. And so it's not the reward. There is something hardwired into them to look for intimacy. They're looking for intimacy from the most intimate thing that's there, that's soft and furry, but then it gives them nothing back. Very depressing, unfortunately. And he kind of draws a few things out of this. Proximity maintenance. The child strives to be near a parent. Separation distress. This is the work of John Bowlby. John Bowlby, I actually have a letter from John Bowlby. It's not given to me. I met a lady when I was walking my dogs. Her dog sadly died, so I haven't seen her for a while. Turned out she's a chaplain in a university and did similar things like I was doing with students, and we would talk and so on. And she brought me a letter she'd written to him just before he died, and he'd sent her a very nice little letter. So John Bowlby was a British psychologist. These are some of his conclusions as he's looking at attachment in infants. So proximity and separation. So proximity is key. Child wants to be close to someone. It wants to be connected. it gets distressed when you separate them. This is hardly rocket science. There's a safe haven principle. The child draws comfort from the parent when they're distressed. And as a secure base, the child uses the parent as a base to explore and grow from. So you can kind of see issues of connection in here and security, you see. Connection and security, which are part of the marriage vows, part of the feed and breed kind of section of who we are. When we feel secure, we're less fearful and so on. Really very fundamental things. I'm going to skip through some of these about him. You can read them in your things, but they're just interesting to see, because this is the well, let's get to the text again. I should have had a picture of Tina Turner here, shouldn't I, with what's love got to do with it. So in one sense, love is a social construct, which actually social constructivism is a theory of sociology. You know, that actually we kind of make the world to some degree by the way we use language. And it's true to a degree. So love is a social construct. You know, we often hear about it now when people go and say sex is a social construct or gender is a social construct. But actually, people use the word incorrectly. You can't choose to be absolutely anything you want to be. It's just that the way you define something real might impact the way it affects you. Because I've put here, so death is a social construct as well. But that doesn't mean you don't really die. So just because love is a social construct doesn't mean it's very real, if I can put it that way. It's just the way we talk about it, the way we kind of put it together. And romantic love is even more so. So, you know, what we think of as romantic love is very different in the Western world to the way it might have been in the Eastern world or in the ancient world. But that doesn't mean there's not something real at the heart of it that we're just constructing our language around. But actually, as part of that, it's sometimes worthwhile. This is where we're finishing now. As I said, we started saying that the concept of the marriage of the lamb and his bride, and actually, if you go to the beginning of it with, say, the Song of Solomon, there's this intense desire to connect. Is part of the mix. But actually, when we look at romantic love, you can actually see two very distinct elements. There's passionate and there's companionate love. And the passionate love is similar effect to highs of heroin and cocaine, whereas compassionate love is a kind of high point of serotonin and oxytocin into connection. So there's a desire that drives us, and then there's something that completes us, and the companionate love flows out of that second layer. So there's a little graph which I've taken this image from the Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt. So it's, I didn't want to try and reproduce that with numbers because it's too complicated, so I took a photo of it instead. But you can hopefully kind of see this is just the shape, really. This is the dotted red line is passionate love. How does it change over time? They measure it with a self-reporting system with people. And this is the 6-month look. So over 6 months, there's a very high passionate intensity, desire right at the beginning. As the months go on, it kind of levels off. As it levels off, some people bail out because it's no month. You notice the change more than you notice where you are. It's just the way hormones work in us in those ways. So as we kind of level off, there's a danger point where the relationship will break down. But then it gets even worse because there's a bit of a big fall off kind of at some point. And will the relationship make it past this 3-month point or whatever? If it does, there's a kind of kick up and then it drops down again. And actually, as time goes on, the passionate side starts to trail off. We're seeing the companionate bit just slowly growing. And as you look over the longer term, actually what you see is the companionate love kind of goes on for quite a long while before it starts to stop growing, but it never tails off. So companionate love always keeps growing. It might grow slower, but it never stops. Whereas passionate love is constantly on the way down. Now, if you're a mathematician, you realise that you could kind of create a sense of the measure of the value of these two things by working out the area under the curve. The area under companionate love is much bigger than the area under passionate love. In other words, in the long term, we want to turn passionate love into companionate love. It feels very different. We might remember that high peak with intensity at the beginning where it looked like it as a single moment. It was right up there and high. But actually, if we keep on trying to achieve that, we never get the longer term actually where the weight is. Does that make sense? So we want to create that companionate love. Okay, so well, it's slightly in the wrong order, but Jesus takes quite a, he says he's made that statement. It's like you've committed adultery. Sorry, it's like you're looking at a woman lustfully. That's like you committed adultery. You might not think of it like that, but that's the way it is. And he says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, you should be really severe about it. So in other words, the looking and the right eye, but of course, if you take your right eye out, you've still got your left eye. Jesus is speaking in hyperbole. You find it regularly in the rabbinic writings. They talk in extremes to make a point. The point Jesus is making, so you're looking at someone, it's creating a lust. You actually have a commitment to someone else over here. You are now entertaining thoughts towards somebody else. Actually, this is really serious, and he uses very strong language. Deal with it. I touched on in the Wednesday quick sessions I'm doing that once somebody, maybe I did this last week as well here, once you've kind of settled something, if you decided I'm now with this person for good, you're far less likely, you see it in the brain, you're less likely to be tempted by other people. If you're being tempted by other people, it's actually undermining the relationship here, because now the front part of your brain is making decisions all the time because you haven't settled the issue. So the issue's not settled. You're looking at someone lustfully. And really it's just a matter of time and situation. And one day you're going to fail. You can use willpower to try and manage yourself here. I'm not going to do it even though I really want to. I'm not going to do it because I really want to. And then eventually you will. Whereas if you've just settled it in the positive sense of this is my person, this is my relationship. So Jesus takes a very strong line. He says, look, he's using hyperbole. If your right eye is causing you to sin, chuck it out. It's better that you lose one part of than your whole body gets thrown into Gehenna. So Gehenna, of course, is because you've actually acted on it. You've done something with it now. See, that's the way they taught, wasn't it? The rabbis, we saw it in the Bravia Metzia, that Jesus is talking into that context. And so you're looking, that's causing a problem. Now your right hand is reaching out to do something with it. If it's going to cause you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. So actually what Jesus is doing is actually, if you like, when we looked at Train the Elephant, he's doing things which are about dealing with the environment. And the consequences are so severe that actually if we just deal with the environment, that helps. And actually if you're going to do things like deal with pornography habits and so on, very often it's putting things into the environment to make it harder is actually a very sensible thing to do. So I won't mention who they are. I know I had a friend who was very open with the fact that they had on his computer, he had a service that sent a report to someone he was accountable to what his internet browsing was. And he said, just makes it really easy. He said, I know they're going to see it. So I feel suddenly that temptation has gone away, you see. So but actually Jesus is advising things like that. Find a simple, don't be so kind of precious. Oh dear, I'm so terrible. I'm kind of going down this line. But find simple ways, trying to do something with it. But then he then gets into this issue of the sophistry that is allowing some of these behaviours. He said it's also been said whoever divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I would say that everyone who's divorcing his wife, except on account of sexual immorality, coerces her to commit adultery. And whoever marries her who has been divorced commits adultery too. So the situation in Jesus' day, I put here, this is the sophistry of the rabbis. So here we go. This is Rabbi Wars. Here is Hillel. Here is Shammai. There was a debate going on in the generation before Jesus between two famous rabbis who have schools and disciples. Around Jerusalem and Judea, the Shammaites in Jesus' lifetime were the dominant force of the rabbis. But the Hillelites were quite popular when it came to getting divorces, because they had looked at the verse in Deuteronomy that says if a man finds an indecent matter, which was understood to mean adultery, in his wife, then he can divorce her. And the Hillelites, who are much more missionary minded. They were much more lax, and probably in a lot of ways Jesus looks like a Hillelite in the way he interprets the law. They had said, well, that any matter means you can divorce your wife because she's offending you. So if she's a bit old and a bit ugly, then you can now divorce her. It really is as kind of trivial as this. We find these kind of reasons there. So now there are synagogues and rabbis who will give you the certificate of divorce for any matter. And you hear that phrase, I think, in when Jesus uses the term in Mark, if a man divorces, or is it in Matthew, man divorces his wife for any matter. So they will give the divorce for any matter if you just turn up there. Whereas the Shammite said, no, it actually has to be proper adultery. So on this occasion, Jesus is saying, I'm more like a Shammite, because he's saying, if you're divorcing your wife using an any matter divorce, which almost all of them are now because they're the easy ones to get, you just go and find a nice liberal rabbi, Hillelite, and he'll give you a certificate of divorce. So now what's happening is you're actually breaking the whole point of this relationship, which out of all these post-social strengths and relationships and society kind of grows from. But you're missing all of that because you found a religious way of interpreting it and doing an immoral thing in a supposedly religious way. So in that sense, he sides with the Shammites. In lots of other ways, he doesn't. As we're going to see as we go through, there's references from the Dead Sea, from Qumran and so on. Jesus sits in a different place to all of them because he's got a different approach to the way he understands the law. But that's part of the context why he's saying that you're basically forcing your wife to commit adultery, or if she gets remarried, then that's an adultery anyway. Because she wasn't really divorced by you. Because actually, here's the thing: when a woman has been divorced, she's no longer married. So so for somebody who is married, who has an affair with her when she's divorced, it's not actually proper. It's not a proper adultery, because he's not an adulterer because she's not married. It was an offence to the husband. This was the rabbinic teachings. Now, it would be unfair to say all the rabbis, but it's the kind of sophistry that is going around. And it's totally undermining the principle of which marriage was supposed to be there for, you see. So this simple idea of how you're entertaining these thoughts, which is actually then leading you, and it's led you to kind of make it kind of casual, and in which case you're undermining the relationship. And actually that's such a building block. Out of that comes stable family. Out of stable families comes stable communities. Out of stable communities come just nations. Out of just nations, actually we see kind of peace emerging. There's a very real link, and here's the first link in the chain. And we're 2 minutes over. We'll just finish these quickly. Again, you've heard it was said previously, don't swear and make fake promises and keep your oaths to the Lord. But I would say to you, not to swear at all, either by heaven, because that's God's throne, or by earth, because it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Nor should you swear by your head, because you can't make a single hair white or black. But rather let your affirmation of yes mean yes, and no mean no. Anything else implies evil. So we've got this sophistry again, which is actually, it means more yes if I swear by this way than it did before. It's actually, in type, it's very similar to what's been done with the marriage debate. Where you can suddenly now divorce for any old reason that you like. And if you're having an affair with someone who's actually divorced but not remarried, you're not having an affair at all. You see the sophistry that's involved, the non-purity of heart, and we've got a similar thing going on. Well, I only really meant it because I swore by the gold in the temple. I swore by by heaven and earth. I swore that I didn't say it right. I didn't say I cross my heart and spit and swear upon the grave of my mother. If I'd said that and I wasn't crossing my fingers at the time, then it would have counted. But otherwise, I wasn't really crossing my fingers, or whatever. So do you remember these guys from the other week? Moral character predominates in person perception. We find reasons. Moral hypocrisy, therefore, is all over the place. And we see these kind of things going on. I introduced this slide and I didn't talk about it, so I'll just quickly mention it. Robert Cialdini was looking at what he thinks calls integrity in workplaces, by which he really means honesty. It's actually how really can I take your word? How honest are you? How much do you mean what you say? Those kinds of things. And he finds that actually there are three malignancies or three cancers that grow in work contexts where there's a low moral standard, a low standard of honesty. So if I just quickly touch on, basically, kind of cut a long story short, Places with low moral standards attract people with low moral standards. So if you've created a culture in which their standards are low, you attract people who are like that. When you lure in people who have higher moral standards than the workplace does, they don't stay long. They leave. And then what actually happens is that the low moral standards that you brought in actually create a dynamic that then starts to damage the organisation from the inside. Now, I've done that in a few statements. He's got a lot of research that shows how these dynamics work. But it all comes down, but the kinds of things that he starts with are very, very simple. They are when you say yes, do you know that you mean it? There's a difference when you say yes and you're kind of overestimating your ability, and when you know perfectly well when you're saying yes, I can do that you're not. When you're presenting yourself knowingly as not being able to deliver what you're promising to deliver just to get the contract. These kinds of things, which are basically your yes not being yes and your no not being no, actually create a context and environment that creates these cancers that in the end take down companies. And I don't know whether it went into your notes or not. He tells the story in his book, that his previous book, of what he refers to a company that purely because of these simple dynamics lost billions from their public listing, billions of dollars from their public listing for things that actually look like very simple untruths and lies, but it kind of the way it crescendos and grows. So in both areas, both the areas we've looked at tonight, purity of heart actually has a big implication. There's a huge amount of research that we do into these things. Actually, it's probably too simplistic to say, but it resonates very really. That actually, if you look at the loosening up of things like divorce laws and the more casual approach to marriage, because it's not just the laws, it's the approach you bring to it, you can probably kind of map that with actually the decline in relationships that happen more generally, to the point now where people can't relate to people that don't agree with them 100%, and even then they're often falling out and don't know how to build strong relationships. Our ability as a culture to build strong relationships, you can probably track its downward trends against the upward trends of the breakdowns of marriage and expectations for what marriage means. And these ideas are embedded right there in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. They seem small, but actually they're there for a reason, because their consequences are enormous. So that I've gone over a bit, but I think hopefully tonight was quite, I could go on for hours on these subjects, to be honest, particularly this one, because there's so much that flows out of it. But does anyone want to ask anything or make any kind of comments or statements before we go on?